en masse. But anyway, all right. Okay, well, we've got 3 more sessions, and I put up something on River to give an indication of what they're going to be focusing on. So this week we're looking at Nietzsche, feminism, truth, those kind of things. Talking a little bit more about post-structuralism and the relationship between Nietzsche and recent French continental theory and philosophy. Then next week we'll go on to post-humanism, transhumanism, all those other extra-human, meta-human things that Nietzsche is often implicated in by contemporary thinkers, and which you could argue Nietzsche can be used very critically against as well. And then in the final session, I thought it would make sense to deal with all the various strands that we haven't had time to deal with elsewhere, to some extent talking about the contemporary uptake of figures like Nietzsche, and Niall mentioned Carl Schmitt last week. I'll talk a little bit about him because he's interesting, by the far right, how they justify that, and how the left also take up Nietzsche. Why is it that he's so adaptable and flexible in this way as a thinker? And that actually applies to feminism as well, because he's not the most obvious thinker that you would imagine would feed into contemporary or recent feminism, bearing in mind that he, to some extent, has a reputation for misogyny, which is partially justified and partially not, as so many thinkers have said. He's a curious figure. You can't really separate the life from the thinking with a figure like Nietzsche, because he certainly doesn't. So his own, I don't know, his refusal, his inability, the fact that he never really forged a conventional sexual relationship with a woman, even though he was, so far as we know, ostensibly heterosexual, sometimes bears on the kind of biographical perception of Nietzsche and his attitude to women. He did nonetheless have a series of pretty close relationships, friendships with intellectual women, and he clearly liked intellectual women, and did engage a great deal in the discussions around the figure of woman in contemporary culture, to the extent that, as always with Nietzsche, it passes through the various filters of his extraordinary intellectual dynamism to produce images and metaphors that are about the feminine in some symbolic sense, and the masculine in some symbolic sense, which isn't necessarily reducible to straightforward biological gender or even cultural gender. And this is why feminists in the 60s, 70s and 80s in particular, and subsequently, were able to draw on Nietzsche and argue the case against the reading of him as a misogynist, and take up his ideas for later stages of feminism. And in particular, the kinds of feminism that moved away from the first wave. Now, generally when philosophers talk about feminism, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, there's a distinction made between the essentialist and the constructivist traditions. The essentialist traditions will tend to argue that men are men and women are women, effectively. There's some essential quality to being male and being female, which may or may not be connected to physicality. It usually is. You find some very strong arguments currently which claim not to be essentialist, but I would say probably are, among TERFs, so-called, who are exclusionary feminists.
Sorry, Charlie.
TERFs, this is a group of feminists who oppose the idea of transgender women as being women.
Have they got a nickname?
TERF.
What did you? A TERF?
Yeah, trans exclusionary radical feminist. It stands for.
Okay, thanks. That'd be Jermaine Greer. People like her.
She's been, and Suzanne Moore. Quite a few people have gone into that camp, and this is there's a very big debate going on amongst those groups about whether this is essentialism or not, because so much of it is based on the fact you can't call yourself a woman unless you've been through the whole process of, coming into menstruation, having a womb, and so on and so forth. So the physicality of male and female gender, sexuality and sexual identity is clearly crucial to any perception of the history of feminism and related masculinisms, if you like. And what happens in the 60s and 70s is there is for a while, a move away from the essentialist model of male and female, and the adoption of an idea that gender is effectively constructed by the culture around you. Yes, you may be born with a particular body type, which may be classified biologically as male or female, or possibly in between, who knows? But the actual construction of gender takes place on a cultural level. And someone like Judith Butler, who was really influential and certainly influenced by Nietzsche too, very influentially talked about the performativity of gender. She also talked about the performativity of queer identities and so on and so forth. The idea that these are things that are created. That could draw on Nietzsche, because Nietzsche.
Interject?
Go on. Dan.
There's a bit of ruling, I think maybe today or recently. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's in sport. There's a trans woman, and they've made some ruling. I don't know if it's in her favour or against her. I think it's against her running in a certain race because she's got an unfair advantage, because I think they're talking about having a period of a year before you're allowed to take part in competitive sport after transitioning. And I'm wondering if that's, so if you think about something like flat earthers all those years ago, they must have continued to argue for a flat earth well into the next century. And eventually they sort of gave up because,
right.
So the point is, once something is in law, it becomes much more difficult to argue for that thing, doesn't it?
Well, against it, you mean?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, where that, how. Anyway, I was just wondering where you see that.
No,
going.
I don't know. I mean, it's a very heated debate going on at the moment. I mean, in sort of Western liberal capitalist societies anyway, there has been a massive shift in attitudes towards gender fluidity and so on and so forth, and sexual orientation. There's far more general acceptance than there certainly was in the past. That certainly isn't true everywhere in the world. But there's also a kind of reaction against it from within formerly radical areas. And this is the curious thing about it amongst radical feminists who oppose transgender women, calling themselves feminist women, etc. This is a real flashpoint. And I think it's possibly generational to some degree, because I certainly don't encounter that amongst my students, who even kind of fairly orthodox Muslim girls have no issue with it at all. So I don't know, maybe generational, I'm not sure. But I suppose my point is that Nietzsche allows for the possibility of the reinvention of self. And this is something that a generation of women certainly absorbed in very, very different ways in many cases. So, I mean, one of the things is to trace out how this happens. And one of the very important reference points for this history is actually cis male, as we say now, Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida, I suggested you have a look at Question of Style in that new Nietzsche book, which was then later extended into a book called Spurs, which I also put up for people who are interested.
Yeah, but I watched the Metzinger video that you posted, and he said that the self is continuously evolving. It's not something. It's like it's just in constant like evolving state. I don't really. I mean, Metzinger is. I mean, it's slightly off course, but yeah, Metzinger draws to some extent on some ideas of Nietzsche, in as much as he sees the self as a process rather than anything fixed. And this is certainly something you could claim that Nietzsche indicated. Prior to that, there was a notion of identity as something that existed through time. The idea of personal identity existing through time is something that was always challenging to philosophers, right back to Heraclitus, sort of 600 BC, who was arguing against that and claiming, you can't step in the same river twice, possibly not even once. Everything changes all the time. So what is it about the self that remains consistent in that, throughout that? And Metzinger takes a fairly extreme position. Number. Yeah, done.
National insurance number.
Well, there is that, yeah, but then again, people argue that it depends who's reading it. I mean, somebody might read that as something completely different. But yeah, it's a good point.
I don't think the self is related to the sex of the person, though, is it?
Well, some people think it is. Some people think it isn't. I mean, there are certainly essentialist thinkers who would say it is. You're born. I mean, you're born straight or gay. You're born male or female. Your identity is very much fixed in some sort of biological determination. There are people who would argue that. There are other people who would argue that no, we can transition, we can change with a combination of technology and attitude. you can be who the hell you like. I mean, that actually leads into all kinds of other complexities about identity. But it is very important to see Nietzsche as, in many ways, the person who triggered this by indicating the fluidity of notions of identity. That's not all he does. He does quite a lot of other things, and perhaps it's not. It's too easy to caricature the Nietzschean position as just that, because it isn't that. But it's what feeds into certain strands of feminism in that period. I'm going back to someone like Jacques Derrida. And Derrida, I don't know if any of you have ever studied Derrida with FUB or elsewhere, or read him. Have you? I don't know if he's someone people read.
Read a bit.
A bit. I mean, he was enormously influential when I was at the university. He was in certain circles. I mean, analytic philosophy didn't have any time for him at that point, but continental philosophy was full of him, and so were English literature departments. And this is partly because of his popularity in America. There was a very famous conference in 1972 in Ithaca, in Cornell University, where a whole load of French intellectuals, including people like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and others, gave a presentation effectively of a whole new school of thinking about identity, about textuality, about every aspect of philosophy, which came to be known as post-structuralism. And this idea of post-structuralism, which to some extent was a kind of brand, a bit like deconstruction, which was another thing that came from this conference, dominated English departments, certainly for 30 years, many literature departments and certain philosophy departments. And Jacques Derrida was the kind of the biggest star in that firmament. And he's, I don't know, I went off him quite a long time ago, but I'm reading him again now, and he's certainly worth reading. You know, he became a bit too fashionable, a bit like Gilles Deleuze these days, unfortunately. No, he's good though. But Dan,
sorry, a bit like who?
Gilles Deleuze.
You said he's a bit.
Gilles Deleuze, when I first encountered Gilles Deleuze, it was a bit like your favourite band no one's heard of, but now he's kind of everywhere, and it's a bit, you know, it's a bit like your favourite band has become commercialised and sold out. You know?
Why did you describe it as going a rabbit hole?
What rabbit hole? What? Sorry.
You described Deleuze as going down a rabbit hole.
Oh, that was me. Well, it's a rabbit hole. Gilles Deleuze is really, really into Lewis Carroll for a start. So it's a reference to that.
Okay, didn't know
he wrote a book called The Logic of Sense, which uses Lewis Carroll's Alice stories to generate a new kind of philosophical thinking about all kinds of stuff. So yeah, I mean, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, when you go down that path, it takes you into new areas which are unlike anyone else, I think, probably. So that's what I meant. But yeah, Deleuze was very important because he wrote a book on Nietzsche and philosophy, which brought Nietzsche back into the fold in many ways. There had been a few others in the 60s who'd done that, but he combined, there are all kinds of things about Nietzsche which resurfaced in this period. One of which was some of the background to his thinking, which may not have directly affected his thinking, but certainly indirectly did. And when it comes to gender, there was a figure called Bachofen, Bachofen, who wrote a book which claimed that the history of human culture had been through a matriarchal phase before it became a patriarchal phase. He argued that the early human cultures were feminine in orientation, and they worshipped the mother goddess. And then this was hijacked effectively by patriarchal deities and gods and systems. And they were different in character. This is what he was effectively suggesting. This thinking had a really big influence on quite a lot of thinkers in France and Germany in the 19th century, and then was revived in certain strands of feminism from the 1940s, 50s onwards in Anglo-American culture as well. The idea of there being a matriarchal society that preceded a patriarchal society is still very much present if you look at Wiccan thinking, for example. The Wiccan philosophies are very much based on this myth that's been projected backwards towards this idea of matriarchal preceding the patriarchal, and they're being essentially different in the way they formulate culture. So Nietzsche, although he may have not bought into the Bachofen idea completely, would have been part of the resonance, would have picked up on the resonance of this idea, that there is at a deep mythical level, there is a fundamental distinction between a feminine and a masculine way of viewing the world and dealing with the world. Not necessarily, I mean, the idea of the mythical systems, they're not necessarily based on biology as such, because the myth precedes the biology. So people era were delving back into mythical structures and looking at anthropology and so on to try and come up with some sort of pattern to understand how the concepts of male and female have created culture. Why it is that you have arrived at a situation in which the male is dominant legally, politically, etc., etc., and the female has, you know, a generally submissive role in that culture. You know, the more advanced thinkers were certainly looking at that and trying to understand it in the longer term. And while Nietzsche wasn't particularly sympathetic to contemporary feminism, his reasons for not being sympathetic was that was basically that he believed that the women who were arguing the case for equality with men and so forth were merely becoming subsidiary men. Now, who's stuck up there saying, oh, it's Helen. Helen, yeah, you want to say something?
Oh no, I was just pleased about what you were saying, that's all.
Okay, cool. So the background, Bashafan does influence Gilles Deleuze. And in one of Gilles Deleuze's earliest publications, Coldness and Cruelty, he writes about Bashafan, because Bashafan was a big influence on a writer called Baron von Sacher-Masoch, who some of you may have heard of because he gave his name to masochism, famously in a book called Venus in Furs, which, as many of you will know, is a title that Lou Reed took up with for a very famous Velvet Underground song. But Venus in Furs is veined with Bashafan's thinking, because Sacher-Masoch was. So this strand of thinking actually weaves through German and French culture and enters British culture, Anglo-American culture a little bit later. This idea of a kind of archetypal feminine and masculine in some form. And while Nietzsche may not engage directly with Bashafan, he certainly engages with mythology. And there are female figures, female mythical figures who permeate his texts in various forms from the early stage onwards, just as Dionysius does. Dionysius is, of course, an extremely important figure for Nietzsche from the beginning to the end. And that's why I kind of like subtitled this module, course, whatever, with his name. And towards the end of his life, when he kind of flipped effectively, he started to identify more and more with the figure of Dionysius, Dionysius, the god that tears himself apart. And he also projected the figure of Ariadne onto Cosima Wagner, who he always had some kind of, you know, infatuation with throughout his life, along with Lou Salome, Wagner's wife. Now, the myth here is quite important. Ariadne is an important figure for Nietzsche, but he's an important figure as picked up by some of the feminists who read Nietzsche and incorporated Nietzsche into their feminism. Luce Irigaray being one example. And one of the books I put up there, The Marine Lover of Friedrich Nietzsche, is, some of it anyway, is fundamentally based on the idea that Ariadne is talking back to Dionysius. Now, to get some background to this, you need to know the myth of Ariadne. And the other mythological figure who's quite important for today's perception of feminist Nietzsche is Baubo, who's a far lesser known mythical figure in Greek culture. Sarah Kaufman, who I've also put on the list, wrote a very influential essay called Baubo, or The Theology of Perversion and Fetishism in Nietzsche. Sarah Kaufman was an avowed Nietzschean feminist all her life, to the extent that she committed suicide on Nietzsche's 150th birthday to coincide with that. She was clearly obsessed with Nietzsche, but her figure of Baubo actually appears in the beginning of The Gay Science, in the preface to the second edition, I think it is. Yep, here it is. I'll just kind of read this one thing to you. I mean, not the whole thing, but is it true that God is present everywhere? A little girl asked her mother. I think that's indecent. A hint for philosophers. One should have more respect for the bashfulness with which nature has hidden behind riddles and iridescent uncertainties. Perhaps truth is a woman who has reasons for not letting us see her reasons. Perhaps her name is, to speak Greek, Baubo. Baubo was a female demon. Mythology. And in a curious kind of way, he's dedicating the gay science to the figure of Baubo. And the figure of Baubo and the figure of Ariadne and a few other mythological figures like Circe, the witch, keep on recurring in his texts. So to try and get a handle on how feminisms have drawn from Nietzsche, it's quite important to grasp the mythological substrate that operates under his text. About Baubo, there are a few stories, not many. She was a god of obscenity, she is represented in old figurines as lifting her skirts and showing her genitalia, maybe farting occasionally. I mean, it's this kind of behavior. It's rather like in Celtic mythology, you have the Sheelan and the Gig. I don't know if you come across this figure. You sometimes see on old churches, Celtic churches, who reveals her genitals and generally displays herself in a way that's offensive to Christian values.
So what's it called?
Sheelan Nagig. Sheelan Nagig, or Sheelan Nagig.
Gaelic, is it?
Yeah, PJ Harvey
Yeah.
brought out an album with that name, I seem to remember.
Okay.
Yeah, so there you go. So Bao is a demon who she made Demeter laugh when Demeter was really upset when Persephone was taken by Hades and the whole world went dead. Fertility died on the planet because her daughter had died. So Bao was the only one who could make Demeter laugh. So she's not a very important figure in mythology, but she's one that Nietzsche clearly takes up in this particular phase of his life, and Sarah Kaufman runs with at a later stage. So we'll come back to Bao in a short while. The other Ariadne, you may recall that the legend of the Minotaur on Crete, that King Minos and Queen Pasiphae were ruling the Mycenaean kingdom of Crete. Pasiphae was the daughter of Helios, the sun, and sister to Circe, the witch who appears in the Odyssey. Pasiphae had various children, one of whom was Ariadne, but she also had an affair with a bull who emerged from the water. She became obsessed with having sex with this particular bull because she'd been enchanted by Zeus, who transformed himself into a bull to violate women. You know, this is what he used to do. He used to transform himself into various animals to ravish women of his time. And in this case, the product of that particular assignation was the Minotaur. So Ariadne is related to the Minotaur as a kind of half sister. The Minotaur is a very dangerous beast. Minos is extremely pissed off that his wife has had sex with this bull in the sea anyway, and he puts the Minotaur underground and gets his chief technician, his engineer Daedalus. He's also famous for designing wings and trying to fly to the sun with his son Icarus. You may recall he creates the labyrinth, this extraordinary maze underground, and the Minotaur is placed in the center of it. But do you know the story of the Minotaur? Many of you kind of remember this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you remember what happens? Like Athens is forced to send 7 female virgins and 7 young men every year to be eaten by the Minotaur as a kind of sacrificial gesture, because at that point Heraclean Crete is more powerful than Athens, so they can demand tribute from Athens. The Athenians are not happy about this, and so the king's son Theseus, is the great hero of the Athenians, is sent along with them with a view to subverting it. While he's in Crete, about to be sent into the labyrinth, he meets Ariadne. Ariadne falls in love with him and promises to help him. So he goes into the labyrinth and she gives him a thread, you remember, to allow him to come out of the labyrinth when he's killed the Minotaur. So he goes in with his sword, kills the Minotaur, and comes out with Ariadne's thread. He then, because, well, there are various versions of this, but according to the main one, he promised to take Ariadne away with him, because obviously Ariadne could not stay in Crete after having gone against the wishes of her father. So they sail off together, and as far as Ariadne is concerned, she's going to get married to Theseus, the great hero of Greek culture. But Theseus isn't like that. He's very fickle. He's a philanderer, and he abandons her on an island, the island of Naxos. While she's weeping and lamenting on the Isle of Naxos, Dionysius comes to her, and she forms a relationship with Dionysius. And this is a kind of foundational myth in many ways for the birth of Europe, for all kinds of reasons.
I've just read this exact myth. Did you post it somewhere?
No, I didn't think I did. This is synchronicity. You know, as Jung would call it, just pure coincidence.
Oh.
Now, Nietzsche at one point seems to be claiming that, Europe made the wrong turning when it chose to go with Theseus rather than Dionysius. You know, Ariadne is a very important point for him, because Ariadne ends up with Dionysius, who's the older god who tears things apart and tears himself apart. Whereas modern culture, European culture, went with Theseus, who's the far more practical man of action, right? So the figure of Ariadne is very important for Nietzsche in that respect, as a kind of symbol of something, of a connection to a far older and far more archetypal way of viewing the world. Right. So when Ariadne appears in Nietzsche's text, she has that kind of complexity. She's also connected with labyrinths, and philosophers love labyrinths at the best of times. And, you know, the whole idea of the maze is crucial to someone like Leibniz as well, but Nietzsche picks up on that too. So the symbolism is really resonant and very complex. Now, with these two figures, you have Ariadne and Balbo. You also have Circe, who is most prominent in the Odyssey of Homer. I don't know what your familiarity with Homer's Odyssey is, but at some point on his travels, Odysseus fights in the Trojan War. Do you know the background to this at all?
I know most of it.
Okay, well, I won't tell the whole story, but basically there's a war outside the gates of Troy that goes on for, could be decades, who knows? I mean, it varies according to how you measure it. Achilles and Hector fight. Achilles is the great hero, but Odysseus is there as well, fighting for the Greeks against the Trojans. And at the end of the war, everybody heads off home. The Greeks win against the Trojans ultimately, but Odysseus gets delayed because he's insulted Poseidon, the god of the sea. So he's constantly delayed. It takes him as much time to get back to his home in Ithaca as it does for the war to actually have been carried out. And en route, he has lots of adventures, including shacking up with various nymphs and witches, one of which is Circe. And Circe is an extraordinarily powerful witch. She transforms Odysseus's men into pigs initially. She can do that. She's a sorceress in every way. But she and Odysseus do have a very real and very strong relationship in the course of this story of Homer's. And Circe's a figure of transformation. She's another female figure who appears in Nietzsche's texts. Why this matters probably to more recent feminism is because for all the occasionally overt misogyny or sexism that you might find in Nietzsche, there's another current that runs through Nietzsche's work on a symbolic level, which seems to indicate that there is something fundamentally wrong about the way in which masculine and feminine are configured in Western culture. And they are connected to the concept of truth. So this is why, in this kind of rather circuitous way, I come back to the opening of Beyond Good and Evil, when Nietzsche...
You kind of lost me a bit after...
Yep.
When we were in the Odyssey,
yep.
Then we came back to Nietzsche, and I didn't quite see how we got there.
I was talking about Circe as a figure of female empowerment.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Circe is an enchantress, so she's a goddess of she's a quasi goddess of illusion. You know, she creates magic, and magic in some ways
she transforms his crew into pigs.
Into pigs, but she can enchant. If you're a witch, you can enchant people so that they perceive the world as different to what it is. Yeah, that's effectively what a witch can do in mythological terms. So Circe has a relationship with truth, with reality, which is about fabrication. She's an artist in a sense. Yeah, so that's the way it kind of links. Just as Nietzsche suggests that Ariadne, you know, in the Ariadne story, going for Theseus suggests instrumental rationality, practicality, truth, effectively, rather than Dionysius, which is something else. There is a relationship between the figure of woman in Western thinking and Western culture and the concept of truth that he wants to disinter, that he wants to subvert, that he wants to overturn. So when at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, he famously begins by saying, what if truth is a woman? What then? Right? Now that's an extraordinary question for a philosopher in this period to ask. And it seemingly comes out of nowhere. In fact, it doesn't come out of nowhere, but it's a really interesting question because he's directly relating the concept of truth to femininity in some way.
But isn't that just doing the masculine?
You've gone, Helen. You've broken up.
By making it a singular. I said, isn't that just the masculine thing to do? Is kind of say that truth is just a singular thing assigned to a woman, whereas really it should be a kind of binary thing where it's man and woman that kind of is within the totality of the language, like sharing it.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know. What do other people think about this? Is there a relationship
Seems
between
quite
truth and gender? Or is this too abstract and obscure?
It's
I mean,
quite
I think that I agree with what you said about there being a kind of different, from my own personal experience, like a different type of spirituality in relation to the world, for like being a woman and not really being able to accept the male interpretation of that.
Right.
But in terms of like, in terms of knowledge, in terms of epistemology, I think that it should be shared. I think the truth should be shared.
Well, I'm saying something should be the case. You're making an ethical point. You know, and as Hume said long ago, there's a difference between an ought and an is. And Nietzsche is perhaps not arguing here for the oughtness of things and the way things should be. He's trying to perceive the way, as he perceives it, the way things are. And the way things are has been configured by human creativity in some sense. So he's trying to get behind that and underneath that through dislodging the conventional ways of thinking that we in the West and possibly everywhere have tended to rely on. And maybe this is the important thing to take when you move to Derrida's version of Nietzsche. Derrida is famous for this concept of deconstruction, which means many things and has been overused as a concept. But one of the most useful techniques that Derrida came up with, which was taken up by an awful lot of people, including a lot of feminists, was the disruption of binary oppositions, the overturning of binary oppositions. There is always an emphasis and a privileging in any binary pair. So truth and falsity in themselves have no distinct value, but we place value on truth and falsity, just as we place value on male and female. Yeah.
Is this beyond good and evil?
It comes from genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil. Yeah.
So
Derrida takes it up and turns it into something completely different. You know, in The Question of Style, this book, I mean, this essay, he's beginning to develop this, but I mean, everywhere in Derrida, there's this idea that we need to try and understand how language operates and how language attaches itself to concepts and how concepts can determine and condition the way we view reality and the way we work in relation to reality. So it's trying to understand the world around us as made up of concepts, effectively.
Maybe we
reality there, but yeah.
Maybe we should diminish value then, like, you know, kind of get rid of the idea of value in order to kind of like fundamentally arrive at some kind of understanding.
But what, all right, if you get rid of value, what have you got in its place? And what else is there?
You've got present.
No, we're losing you again.
I read that article. She talks about a.
Sorry, keep losing you, Helen.
I said what's there instead of value is presence. I read that article that you put up in regards to Lucy Irigoyen,
right.
And she mentioned something called a pure innocent presence.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is where she's getting very Derridian. Derrida talks a lot about presence and absence. He draws a lot of it from Nietzsche, not always, not all of it. I mean, quite a lot of it isn't. But, well, all right. I mean, there's another kind of track here. Heidegger, I talked about last week, called Nietzsche the last metaphysician. He claimed he'd completed metaphysics. We no longer needed metaphysics. And that might mean something like valuation. But metaphysics is effectively a theory of what lies behind appearances. It's a theory of what truth actually is, what being actually is, what existence actually is. Derrida, on the other hand, claims that Heidegger actually continued as a metaphysician and became the last metaphysician himself. So Derrida adopts a position where he's going to be the person after the last metaphysician who maybe buries metaphysics for good. And part of the essence of metaphysics is the concept of presence. The idea that when we talk about anything philosophical, we bring it present to us. And in bringing things to our presence, we deny the absence which lies behind it. Any presence is defined by its absence. So everything is kind of arranged in binary pairs where truth is defined by falsity, which is certainly a Nietzschean concept. You can't have a concept of truth without falsity. But what is the truth of falsity? What is the truth of lying? What is the untruth of truth? Is effectively what Nietzsche's trying to put forward there. And this is, I mean, all right, I'm talking about post-structuralism now. It's not necessarily that easy to grasp. And quite a lot of people reject it because it's seen as too esoteric. I don't know how you find this kind of talk.
I like it.
You like it? Good. Well, I think it's worth getting into. You know, it really does demand a lot. It demands really close reading. And it's not as easy to talk generally about as many areas of philosophy, put it that way.
Well, I started reading the Marine.
Yeah, Marine Lover. Yeah.
Lover, yeah. I started reading that, and I read a bit of it, and I thought, I think I'm going to like this. I'm going to enjoy reading this.
Yeah.
But I didn't know anything about her, so I thought I needed a bit of background. So I did had a look at a short introduction, about sort of 4.5 minute introduction.
Yeah.
You know, one of these animated things with a voiceover. And I thought, okay. So then I looked at a sort of bit more than 2 hour one, which I only watched the beginning. And there's a couple of women on that whose names I've come across in the past.
Right.
So, you know, it seems like it's bona fide to me, you know. That, anyway, I've forgotten what I was going to say. Anyway, I've had a bit more of it, and it seems. You said something that provoked me to say all this. Sorry, I lost my way.
Sorry. Yeah.
I'm responding to something you said. I can't remember what it was.
Was it your opinion on post-structuralism? That's where you started.
That's okay. So I was going to save this for the second half, but I might as well get it out of the way, and I can shut up for a bit. So anyway, so I read a bit more of
Irigaray.
Yeah, and I thought, yeah, you know, like I watched a bit more of the discussion, and then I started thinking that I've come to a sort of point now where I've got to decide why I'm doing this.
Sure.
Because a lot of the time I've just been thinking, oh, that sounds interesting. But I've been doing some reading and, you know, inquiring, thinking. So anyway, I spent the rest of the time looking at stuff about Baudrillard, who I think maybe we're going to come on to, are we, at some point?
Well, Baudrillard, yeah, I mean, we almost certainly will, and probably next week, because Baudrillard draws a lot from that section from The Twilight of the Idols, where how truth became a fable. I mean, so much of his work comes out of that.
I think I might have mentioned him last week. I think so. Anyway, so I got a bit of Baudrillard and did a bit of thinking. And I've got 3. So anyway, I've got some stuff here. So Baudrillard says that, so when I got the internet in 2004, and I'd always heard Malcolm McLaren was into the Situationist, Guy Debord.
Yeah.
So the first thing I did when I got the internet was read the manifesto, then have a look at the film he made of it. And
which manifesto are you talking about?
The
Guy Debord.
Situationist.
Guy Debord.
Situationist manifesto.
Society of the Spectacle, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then I watched the film that Guy Debord made of the Society of the Spectacle. Then I just looked at loads of stuff around it. Anyway, then I remembered. So Baudrillard, I finally got around to reading his book, Simulacra and Simulacrum, in '97, when I was settled for a while. I read that book. No, I didn't read it all the way through, you know, bits and pieces, quite dense text. Anyway, he says in there that he's influenced by Guy Debord. For one, he admits of 3 influences, Nietzsche, Marx, and Guy Debord.
Yeah, okay.
And it seems to me he sort of developed
Guy
Debord's ideas of the Society of the Spectacle. He kind of developed that, is my opinion.
Yeah, Guy Debord also drew Nietzsche. I mean, this is the thing. Nietzsche has universally present in this period in French thinking. And that French thinking seeped through to Anglo-American thinking and German thinking in due course. It's the constant presence of Nietzsche, and there's many Nietzsches that seem to appear in this era that makes him increasingly important. And someone like Baudrillard, yeah, I mean, he was influenced by Debord. They were students together. They were doing their postgraduate work together.
Sorry, who was students together?
Debord and Baudrillard. They're both students of a guy called
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason I bring this up is because at the very beginning of this class, you said that, you gave us some text to read or whatever, saying Nietzsche didn't want philosophy to be languishing in dusty museums and libraries.
Yeah.
He wanted it to be vibrant, present, important, And so when I read Baudrillard, it seemed to me that he was kind of, so I told you, we recently did another course and we were asked to read Foucault and Baudrillard, and then we were asked to read them with a question in mind of how are they different, how are they similar. So when I was asked, I said, I think Foucault is interested in interpreting texts. I think Baudrillard is interested in looking at the world around him and describing what he thinks he sees. This is the difference that I apprehend. So
you're talking about a difference of style here, and this is actually quite important because Nietzsche does talk a lot about style, and they both picked up on that. I mean, Foucault's interested in tracing genealogies. Genealogy is the kind of dominant term for him, which of course he gets from Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality. So, and he, like Nietzsche, believes that all interpretations are interpretations of other interpretations. And part of the revolution that in textual readings that were initiated by people like Foucault, Derrida, Rigoret, and so on, were about the way in which we read texts, which derives directly from Nietzsche. Because prior to that, it varied, but I mean, there was a dominant view that when you read a text, you're reading. Do you want to say something? Go on. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, if this isn't too daft a question, where did Nietzsche land on truth?
He didn't. I mean, truth constantly shifted. I mean, in a sense, all right, there are three images of woman and truth that appear in the later Nietzsche texts, and he's comparing them and contrasting them. This is the way one interpreter has viewed it anyway. There's the form of woman who aspires to agree with the condition of masculinity and will buy the idea of truth that masculinity pervades. There is another image of the feminine, which is about feigning, which is about veils and simulations and cosmetics. It's about a deliberate falsity that is used to gain power in some form or another through seduction. Then there is the third image of woman, who is the one who displays the fact, the reality, if you like, that truth is untruth, that there is no truth, and that is truth. It's a kind of paradoxical position that woman represents for Nietzsche. And this is the one that I guess arguably comes through with figures like Baudrillard, who talks about hyperreality. We are in an age in which the simulation has overtaken the reality. The map has overtaken the territory. So what has happened?
Do you think Nietzsche sort of saw that coming?
Yeah, well, that's what he's writing about, yeah. And he's doing it through the imagery of woman a lot of the time, which is why it's become so central to a lot of the readings of Nietzsche. His own very strange personal life, yeah.
Don't you think the truth is...
You've gone again.
Don't you think truth is unique to has the right to have?
Unique to what?
I said, don't you think truth is unique to the individual and that everybody has a right to use their own voice and speak their own truth? Okay,
I mean, all right, well, have a look at that statement. I mean, what do other people think about that? The idea that everyone has their own truth? It's common, it's a romantic...
You can have your own truth, but
yeah,
you have
Karen?
to...
All right, sorry.
I would claim that whatever it is that everybody has their own of, it's not truth. Truth, if it exists, where it exists, would have to be something that we had a shared understanding of. There has to be some implicit agreement for something to be truthful. There has to be something that you can juxtapose against it as being not truthful. And if everybody has their own version of that, then there would be no consensus, no truth and untruth. And it would be like pinning down jelly. What I would say, Helen, is that whatever you're talking about is your kind of a truth in the sense of wanting to, of one's own essence or something like that. But whether that relates to truth or not is a whole big question, isn't it? I'm still,
No,
I think define truth on my bit of paper, and I've got nowhere with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think what I was referring to is authority. I mean, like when we're talking about what we share, we're talking about, you know, like authority. Like we're dealing with authoritarian forces, like we're dealing with authoritarian language as well. So what I'm saying is that truth doesn't necessarily have to be authoritative in that sense, and that you know, that I think the individual has their own right to determine what they want to say.
Well, I mean, right, there's a version of truth that I think you're rebelling against or defying, which is really perfectly demonstrated in something like George Orwell's 1984, which is very much about authoritarian versions of truth or totalitarian versions of truth. Those of you who read it or have seen the film will remember that Winston Smith works in a particular institution in which they have to adjust language all the time. The view being that if there's no word for something, then people won't understand the concept. So if you get rid of freedom, then nobody will know what freedom is, if freedom is no longer part of the language. And they also play around with truth in a variety of ways. The novel opens with a clock striking 13, which immediately throws any reader who's been used to the idea of 12-hour clocks or 24-hour clocks. And this is because truth itself has been constantly adjusted by authority. So there is that version of truth. And this is something that does derive from Nietzsche, certainly via Foucault, who was really very interested in the concept of the will to truth, as derived from Nietzsche, and particularly from the later Nietzsche, that truth is used as a form of power, not in the sense of the will to power as such, because the will to power is something else. It lies behind the exercise of power and domination. But truth is used in that sense. Religious truth is often used in that sense. Political truth is used in that sense. So I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying there, Helen. At the same time, there is a danger in a complete diversity and pluralism of ideas of truth. So everyone has their own truth. This is the kind of romantic vision of truth that was very much around in the early 19th century. You find it referenced by poets like Keats and Shelley. And this is a different version of truth. When Keats says beauty is truth and truth is beauty, and that's all you need to know. This is a notion of truth that is felt, but it isn't a notion of truth that you could apply to science or technology, for example, or to the reality of poverty. That's a different kind of truth. So one of the things that Nietzsche is certainly bringing to the fore is that truth is a very shiftable concept. It's not simple, it's not straightforward. And the reason he's doing that is because he is critiquing the Platonic tradition, which held, and this works through Christianity too, that there is some sort of extraterrestrial, extra-worldly truth that comes from God or from another world. And all our conceptions of truth draw on this. We use this term truth all the time. We carry it around. It's a concept that is very human. It's like a technology in a curious kind of way. But yeah, Niall, you got your mute on, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was going to say, it seems sometimes the idea of truth is very, very pompous, that we think we've got a truth, and I don't know. I can understand the idea of individual truths, but the idea of there being a big truth out there doesn't make a lot of sense. More and more in a deterministic universe where we've just got this kind of idea of free will in front of us, it doesn't make a lot of sense, really. We're just wandering into what we see as agency. And I guess for some sort of truth, you need agency.
Well, maybe this is about the sense of truth, isn't it? And the sense of agency, which is possibly different.
Yeah, a sense of it, but really just, no, I'm not talking about fatalist, but I'm talking about determinism around it, that gives us that illusion that we have truth, it gives us that illusion that we have agency. Yeah, so it feels rather pompous, the sort of thing that we could all subscribe to some sort of truth out there, and a little bit old now, it's not old-fashioned.
It is. It's still important. I mean, you know, I've talked before about, you know, the correspondence and coherence and pragmatist theories of truth, you know. They're all relevant to this. Dan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. Pete, you probably know me well enough by now to know that I have a problem with moral relativism.
Yeah.
And, you know, if I start shouting and screaming and calling you all filthy names now, you're not going to like that. And you're going to probably maybe switch me off or have me suspended, or I don't know what you do. But
Well, you planning on doing that?
One thing you're not going to do is say that it didn't happen. You're not going to say that. I know you well enough to know that you're not going to say, oh, he didn't get his penis out and start, because if you know, and that is, so I'm doing this now, I'm waving my hands.
Yeah.
And you can all see that. And anyone who wants to argue that I'm not doing that is on a hiding to nothing, you know. So that
or we could be having a shared, Dan, we could be having a shared hallucination.
Yeah.
Or we could have one of those little philosophical demons on our shoulders manipulating us.
Of course we could. There could be little green men manipulating.
Do you see what I mean? There is this thing that we kind of look at, and we might call it, say, scientific veracity. Something that's evidence-based, something that we might call supportable. But do we think that which is supportable is the same as that which is true?
Well, I had that with you before, didn't I? About is justified true belief. Whatever I said.
We had an exchange about
is that truth?
Fact and belief. Yeah.
So
anyway, I think
personally, I think that if you did have an outrage, Dan, I think the truth of the matter would be that there would be a reason behind that, and that there would be a bigger picture to reasons why you would want persecuting you as an individual.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely. Yeah, they would. And so it doesn't really, you would just do that through being another. And that's why determinism gives us kindness in a lot of ways. Because we begin to understand that there's different versions of things. So that version of you doing that would be one form of truth for you, but only for you.
But then, what if I won the lottery and I bribed Dan to act in an obscene way? Whose truth is that?
You won the lottery. Sorry, go through that again. You won the lottery and
I then bribed Dan to act in an obscene manner and challenge him to get thrown out of FUB.
Yeah. What about it?
Wherein lies the truth? Do you interpret something correctly?
Well, again, I'm not saying it's fatal. I'm not saying it's a fatalistic thing. I'm saying that would be part of the determination of what was going to happen in any case. The idea that anybody has any free will in that situation I don't think makes any sense.
Can I speak?
I think the truth would be, don't leave it up to an authoritarian power of language or an authoritarian sort of power in general to make the decision on what the truth is.
Well, all right. Well, what if we all saw
I think
Dan
that we're
doing this?
constantly trying to search.
Yeah. What if we all had a perception of Dan doing obscene things on this screen? Would that collectively make it true? I mean, we could all be having a mass hallucination, I suppose.
Yeah, but that's just sort of Karen's idea of verifying something. So we could all say verify that isn't the truth, because even in science, if we all came up with something that we all came up with something that we verified, there's also a different experiment we could have run that would also be verified. So why would you preference one rather than the other? why would you say one was truth and the other wasn't? If you follow that, you know.
Right.
So that's only verification, isn't it? And it doesn't mean it's the truth of anything, really. If there is such a thing as the truth.
Yeah, well, verification is one aspect, and then falsification is another. And we are getting into the realms of metaphor, which is what I was going to talk about in the second half anyway, and text. But yeah, Dawn, your mute's on, Dawn. Yeah,
I was just going to ask, have different words been developed for different types of what is perceived as different types of truth? Because in some ways it's confined, isn't it, by language and what we were saying earlier.
Yeah,
language confines what you see.
Well, you know, in philosophy, you have the correspondence theory of truth, which is the idea that a statement of truth reflects something real in the world out there. That's the basic idea. Then a coherence theory of truth, that truth is about how everything connects to everything else. So a conspiracy theory might seem true to the person who believes it, like QAnon or whatever, because it fits with all their other ideas. So they would argue that truth actually is relative. You know, it doesn't have to apply directly to something out there. What matters is it forms a pattern which makes sense. So religious truth could work like that, for example. Then a pragmatist theory of truth, which would view truth as whatever works as true. So, you know, you just have to test it as you go along, for example. So, yeah, Dan?
So I've read a bit of Foucault today as well. And if you do Matt Lee's Introduction to Philosophy course, first thing he gets you to do is to try to distinguish between, I think what he calls relationships of ideas and matters of fact. He draws a very clear distinction between, and you have to write down loads of.
And that connects with correspondence and coherence. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, of course. So anyway, I was reading Foucault today, and it's funny, isn't it, how your own thinking comes to, then you find it and someone's already written that ages ago, and you just sort of thought you developed it in your own mind.
Nothing new under the sun, as Shakespeare once said. Yeah.
What did you say?
Nothing new under the sun. Comes from Shakespeare's sonnets.
Of course.
But then Shakespeare said everything. You know, he got everything right. He was not of this world.
But the point is, I thought of Matt's thing when I was reading Foucault, because he kind of says that the truth exists in relations of ideas.
Well, truth emerges from power for Foucaud. It's an emergence from power relations.
I'm aware of that. That's one aspect. But a few paragraphs I was reading this afternoon were concerned with the idea that if you have a set of ideas make sense in relation to other ideas. So I'm talking to you with the idea that you're a philosophy, probably doctor of philosophy, something like that. And the way I'm talking to you, you seem knowledgeable about your subject. So I'm kind of treating you, I defer to you basically, because I think you know more about what you're teaching than I do. So that's a relationship, not just of ideas. In a sense, it's a relationship of ideas. In another sense, it's a power relationship. But so this whole, we're both at the Free University. That's another idea. We're studying Nietzsche and some other people with more pronounceable names. And these are all relations of, all these ideas make sense as a whole in relation to each and every other idea supports each and every, is in the, like the poem, supporting each, the Eliot poem. So, I mean, this makes perfect sense to me as truth, as a, you know, that's, I think that's.
Well, I mean, that could be relations of ideas. Somebody could walk into this session and not have a clue what any of us are talking about because they have no background in this kind of discussion, obviously. So, you know, this is.
But that wouldn't make them, it wouldn't make us wrong, would it?
No.
It would mean that they.
No, but this is the curious thing about philosophy, that it's concerned with things like truth. It wants to know what truth is. And maybe there is no way of knowing what truth is, but regardless of whether we believe that truth is possible or not, we still work according to a belief in truth. It's very difficult to go through life not believing in truth, to believe everything is non-truth, for example.
Karen often likes to say, well, there are things that have been shown to be true by repeated experiment.
Well, that's the scientific method, yeah. But that's about a statement, isn't it? It's about a statement about reality. The truth doesn't inhere in the reality itself.
Did you accuse me of that, Dan? Did you just say that I like to say that?
If I unjustly accused you.
And I want to jump in at this point and be very clear. Science doesn't talk about proving anything. It talks about whether there is an evidence base to support a claim. It's only a claim. It's not an assertion of truth. And it's always done so on the assumption that somebody could come along later and falsify it, prove it to be false. And I have to be very, very clear that science is always accused of making truth claims, and good science absolutely does not do that at all. It's far more sophisticated in its thinking about truth than pretty much any other field.
You're following Karl Popper's ideas there of falsification, which I tend to agree with. I think it is probably the most powerful methodology we have. Yeah.
So working factors, isn't it?
But the point is that the truth doesn't inhere in the, if you're looking at atomic structures, there's no truth in an atomic structure. It's our conceptualization of what's going on, the statement that is made about it as an equation or in some other form that has truth or falsity about it. So truth inheres in our conception, in our language, which may be mathematical.
At that point, then, truth and metaphor become one and the same, don't they?
That's it.
All right, so let me elaborate. So I accept that truth in science is what we know at the moment, and we got to the moon using Newtonian physics, and there was no need for Einstein. So we know more now. So let's look at law. Things become established in law, then there's a precedent is set, then they maybe go to judicial review, and the judgment is overturned. Eventually, laws are built up into a body of law and becomes an accepted thing. Doesn't mean it can't change later. So if say a gardener, you're a gardener, if you look at a tree, you look at a tree, Karen, and you probably see, tell me what you see when you look at a tree.
For the purposes of today, a tree is a metaphor for something.
Okay, well, I look at a tree and I see a beautiful thing growing out of the ground with probably some kind of foliage on it. It's not most trees. So a botanist, a botanist will look at a tree and see a system for absorbing water, nutrients, sunlight, converting, photosynthesis, all of that.
And that system, Dan, that system is a metaphor for something.
Okay. And so when a lumberjack looks at the same tree, sees the potential for loads of wood to make tables, that's a metaphor also. So you're saying truth and metaphor, we can't distinguish between them, are you?
I'm saying that Nietzsche has brought us to this point where he claims, and his successors claim, that truth and metaphor align.
Well, truth is a mobile army. I'm going
to go with that. I'm going to hand it back to Charlie, though.
Truth is a mobile army of metaphors and metonyms and other kind of linguistic instruments. Truth is made up of language. Then, in that sense,
I don't think you need.
No, you're gone.
To kind of turn the tree into a metaphor, Dan, is enough. This idea of metaphor and turning things into misrepresentations, like it's somehow kind of twisting the actual reality on itself into something that's kind of like a kind of made up meaning.
Yeah, thank you.
When actually.
I agree with Helen.
I'm going to go and feed the cat, so I'm going to take 10 minutes break. You can carry on talking if you like. I'll be back to talk about metaphor at 20 past. Okay, So I will see you then, but please keep talking. It's very good.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up this idea of trees. Helen, you faded out, so I don't know what your last comment was. But when we talk about a tree, this word tree is a word, and it stands in the place of an actual tree. It is symbolic of a tree. And underneath this idea...
No, you're talking about a word. You're not talking about a tree, you're talking about a word that represents a tree. You're not talking about the tree, you're talking about a word.
Yeah, but represents is the key idea here. It's the word tree is a representation of a tree. And when we're talking about, well, hang on, Dan, when we're talking about trees, yeah, we're using the concept of a tree.
Yeah.
That applies to more than one specific tree. Okay, so treeness as a concept is a big shared thing, right?
Yeah.
Now that shared treeness that we all agree on is a metaphor and a truth.
So I don't know if you're familiar with René Magritte, and he's got a famous painting of a pipe, and it says underneath,
I mean,
pipe, So
this is it. This is the kind of thing that Nietzsche was talking about. Is that
so I think what he's doing,
we have a shared set of codes. Language is a code, but we have other codes. We could actually point to a cartoon of a tree. We don't have to say it out loud. But the point is, we have a shared understanding of treeness. That treeness is a code. It's a symbol. It's a metaphor. And yet,
I disagree.
It's something that we agree on.
I disagree. I think, yeah,
Go
I disagree.
on,
I don't think we need. I don't think we need to agree on that. I think that for anybody to kind of have a relationship with a tree is to have their to have the freedom to have their own meaning. I think this idea everyone else seems to agree with that.
You faded again.
I said I don't think we all have to agree on what we're seeing is the same thing.
I know, I think you're right.
But when we use the term tree, we all agree on what we mean by tree. Is that true or not?
Yeah, but that's language, but seeing is different. Seeing is like having meaning in the world, whereas language is just something that we use.
You're breaking up, Helen.
Okay. What about
a tree can't lie? Words can lie, but a tree.
What about if we have a picture of a tree and we all agree that it's a picture of a tree?
What about it?
Is that more or less powerful than if we use the shared verbal term tree?
It's still not a tree, it's a representation, isn't it? A tree is a tree is a tree.
But when we see a picture of a tree, do we all agree that we're seeing a picture of a tree? Are we at least agreed on that?
But we're still agreeing on the language. In order to understand that we're all seeing the same thing, we're having to use the word tree. That's why we use communication, so we all understand we're seeing the same thing. That's logos, that's understanding, that's all language is. Whereas when we're seeing something, we have the freedom for our own meaning. We can have a relationship, a personal relationship with our own senses, with our own cognition, with our own, it doesn't have to be a metaphor. It doesn't have to be in what I think is a misrepresentation of something, which is kind of turned into something other than it is.
I think Helen's right. If I come down your garden, Callum, dig up all your plants and vet them, you're not going to say, can we all agree that Dan's been around my garden and dug up all my plants and he's a very naughty boy? You're not going to do that. You're not going to say, this is a representation of a pointless act of vandalism. Are you? You're going to punch me in the mouth, probably, knowing you.
But how does any of this relate to Nietzsche's ideas about truth and metaphor? I think we're off into a different territory now. Basically, a lot of this conversation seems to be about asserting one's own version of what truth is, but Nietzsche came at it by challenging the very idea of truth. So there isn't a whole lot of point in talking about the truth of you robbing my palm trees.
Well, let me put it another way then. Baudrillard is famous for saying that there wasn't going to be a Gulf War. Then when it was happening, he said it wasn't happening. And after it happened, he said it never happened. Now, I think I understand what he means by that. But, I mean, you know, history tells a different story, doesn't it?
So what's your point then about truth?
So my point is that Baudrillard is saying that we were sold this idea that America and Britain were going to...
In concepts, Dan, to keep it brief, Baudrillard, as I understand it, was saying that what we got was not a war, but an image of a war.
Yeah.
Yeah? So he's talking about images, and images are codes for things, aren't they?
He talks constantly about images.
Signs, codes, metaphors, yeah? So when you say you understand what Baudrillard was getting at, but you don't totally buy into it because there was actually a war.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you've done there is you've acknowledged the fact that truth can take lots of forms, including metaphoric or symbolic forms.
Yeah.
But then you have also stated that there is still an underlying truth about the fact that the war happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So there are two ideas of truth. The latter one is the way that we do still live with this idea of truth.
There are only two.
We do still live with the idea of truth.
Are there only two ideas?
Well, bear with me.
Sorry.
The latter idea, we do agree there was a war. It was true. We don't want to let go of that. Much as we find Baudrillard interesting, we don't want to let go of this certainty. Truth is certainty. It definitely happened, right? That was Charlie's point about no matter how much we might challenge truth, no matter how we might have problems defining it, we still cling on fast to the idea that there are truths.
As we've agreed that there was a Gulf War.
Yeah, but we've also agreed that there was a version of truth that Baudrillard had hit on when he was talking about signs and images and simulacra.
Yeah.
Okay. And Baudrillard has come at that because Foucault started undermining truth as certainty.
Yeah, okay, so tell me, this is good.
Because Charlie was talking about women and truth, all right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there's the type of woman who buys the truth of maleness and femaleness, buys into the system, okay? That's her truth. And then there's the truth of a woman who we would call is socially constructed.
Okay.
She's feigning it, she's playing it, you know, like the sort of Butler idea of performing it.
Yeah.
Okay, so Nietzsche feeds directly into that stuff, the feminism, the queer theory, right? Then there's this other idea, which is really, really Nietzschean, and it's the stuff I like, a woman who displays the lack of truth. The fact that it's all made up.
Really?
You know, that femaleness is an impossibility, and that lack of truth, the ability to display, to expose a lack of truth is paradoxically truthful. Okay, so you've got three different versions of...
Could you just say the last one again once?
Sorry, Helen, I'm just going to finish that and then hand over to you. If you display the lack of truth, that paradoxically becomes a display of a truth.
Yeah, that's what troubles me.
I think what I have a problem with is this idea of naming everybody, like naming everybody into some sort of category. And like, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like, and when there's this naming thing going on, there's a lot of negativity, and it's, and as rightly said in the article that was posted in terms of Lucy Uruguay, there's a lot of violence. Like, we can't avoid the violence, and I think part of the violence is being actually named something, and it's usually something quite negative. So I think personally for me, I try to get away from the naming of something, you know.
It's a really interesting point. If there were two key words, forgive me for using words, two key words that came out of reading this week's stuff, it's this post-structuralist fascination with these two terms of violence and impossibility.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not like, words fail me as I try and explain that further, but I think impossibility is something that's kind of come up in our conversation during the break. And I think, Helen, you're really spot on to talk about violence as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that Derrida certainly picks up on from Nietzsche, the idea that the will to truth is fundamentally about some kinds of violence. It is an act of violence imposed. When we philosophize, we're committing acts of violence on other philosophies in some form. And you could argue that Foucault is perhaps moving along the same lines, and what Baudrillard is criticizing, arguably Foucault for, is the absolute relativism that can be generated from this. There is no truth. Everything's an interpretation of an interpretation, is one way you can take that last woman figure in Nietzsche, that the woman whose truth is the revealing of untruth beneath truth. And that doesn't mean, and that sounds like a paradox, because if you say, it's a bit like the liar paradox, you know, if I say I'm a liar, am I lying in that statement? You know, Bertrand Russell gets into that in a big way. And in a curious sense, what Nietzsche says about truth can end up in that. But Derrida takes it somewhere else. He's talking about binary oppositions. The will to power is a collation of forces operating on each other. And you could have binary forces. You could have truth and untruth operating together. So you don't have to actually choose one or the other. You take both at the same time. That's what Derrida calls a double reading. And that's the version of truth as woman that Derrida wants to take in the question of style. And style is the way in which we get round these oppositions for Derrida and for others in that era. Style is really important. Nietzsche is very, very concerned with style. The way in which he writes something is important. He denies the old philosophical idea that philosophical writing can somehow be transparent, and what's beyond it is just revealed to us. He doesn't accept that. Language actually constructs that truth for us. It doesn't reveal it for us. Philosophical language isn't like a window. It's like a mirror. Does that make sense?
There are questions of substance and questions of style.
Okay.
The poem, have you heard it?
No, but I think I know what you mean, but go on.
Some American woman heard this poem. I've been looking for it, I haven't found it yet, but I'll put it up if I find it.
Yeah, well, people, sounds like Dorothy Parker.
Sorry?
Dorothy Parker.
That's what I thought it might be, but I had to search. Sounds like something she would have written, doesn't it?
I mean, that's an old opposition, substance and style, you know, which Nietzsche would probably have problems with, because style and substance are actually interrelated. You know, often you get cultural critics who will accuse something a bit old style and no substance.
Yeah.
For example, but you know, from my perspective, if there's no substance, there isn't any style anyway.
This is what we've been arguing about while we were away.
Yeah. But what you got here is surface and depth. It's another metaphor. It's another binary that the Nietzschean current in people like Derrida and Irigaray and Kaufman would be trying to expose. You know, surface and depth, style and substance, proximity and distance. All these binaries have some kind of effect. We talk about, if you read a text, are you reading the surface of the text, or are you trying to read deeply into it? Most critical thinking in Western history is about going beneath the surface of things. It's looking at the deeper levels. And this is particularly true in the modern age with figures like, say, Marx or Nietzsche. Marx and Marxists look beneath the surface of what appears to be the case in culture and finds the economic machinery beneath it, the power of exploitation operating beneath things that are ostensibly quite innocent. So you look at celebrity culture as a Marxist, and you would see a kind of seduction of the credulous into buying into a capitalist myth which is actually exploiting them and will continue to exploit them with the promise of rewards which will never come, except for a very few. And it's reading beneath the surface for a Marxist and looking at the way in which base and superstructure operate together, in which economic forces create that allows a Marxist interpretation. A Freudian or a psychoanalytic interpretation would look beneath the surface of our everyday behavior, our dreams, our conversations, and find unconscious forces at work, operating, edible or otherwise, and will try to read those unconscious forces. But this deep depth thinking, in a way, is perhaps arguably illusory. Maybe we should be just reading the surface all along. And this is something else that comes out of Nietzsche and is very operative on the Marxist and Freudian readings of that period. Can you have surface readings of depth? These are metaphors, but they're also metaphysical metaphors. They suggest a substance beyond style. It suggests there is something underneath the surface, just as the surface of an ocean. You know, we see the surface of an ocean, but we know there's something underneath it. For Nietzsche, this is all surface. And some Nietzscheans, like Deleuze in some of his work, his Alice in Wonderland book, Logic of Sense, plays around with this depth and surface idea at great length. But this is what Nietzsche's doing. Nietzsche's attention to style is dismantling language and understanding how it operates philosophically, how it operates metaphysically on us at all times. And the way in which truth appears in philosophical language tells us something about the way it's operating. We shouldn't be looking for a real truth beneath the surface of things, according to this view. We just see how truth operates on the surface. And figures like, particularly Irigaray, I think, but also Kaufmann, are concerned with this. When Sarah Kaufmann reads Nietzsche, she was extremely productive. I mean, astonishingly, I mean, Ecce Homo, which is a very short book that we've had a look at, it's often described as an autobiography. You know, why I'm so clever, why I write such good books, etc. Some claim it's indicative of Nietzsche's breakdown and his descent into madness. Kaufmann doesn't buy any of that. She produced 2 enormous volumes called Explosion, reading Ecce Homo. And I think the words in her reading are something like 10 times as long as the book itself. You know, she was that detailed. She produced loads of stuff. And she was concerned with style and surface. This is what drives her, metaphor. She's not really that interested in the big questions like eternal recurrence or the will to power. She's interested in the way in which these concepts play on the surface of language. I mean, that's to begin with. There's a lot more to Kaufmann than that, obviously, but you know, this is something else that comes out of Nietzschean reading, something that Foucault does too, to some extent. There's no truth or only interpretations of interpretations, which is one particular take on a certain version of Foucault in relation to Nietzsche, which was taken up in so-called postmodernism and is now very much attacked and critiqued, because for some, this way of thinking led to Trump. You know, Trump
That's what I said, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the critique of all the stuff that people in the 80s and 90s saw as liberating and emancipating on the left, and now often configured as leading to this monstrosity, you know, where there is no truth anymore and everything's fake, which Trump was a postmodern president. There's no doubt about it in that respect. So he was the living representation of everything that Baudrillard predicted, and certainly Nietzsche did in a way, you could argue. Maybe his relationship to truth is more Nietzschean than the rest of us. Maybe he's got more courage than we have. Or maybe he's just a liar. I think there's some, I can't remember, one of the Gospels is something that Pontius Pilate says, what is truth? And he doesn't hang around to wait for an answer. Which is probably a wise move.
Goes off skipping into the sun.
Goes off skipping into the sun. Pontius Pilate, what an extraordinary image. But yes, he probably did with a lollipop. If you move into the whole thing of surfaces, the way Luce Irigaray does it in particular, and I think she can be beautifully lyrical at times. Her big first book was Speculum of the Other Woman, which is a rereading of philosophy from the position of woman. But the way she constructs woman draws on quite a few other people than Nietzsche, but certainly Nietzsche's present. to stress that kind of surface element. She wrote a shorter piece called The Sex That Is Not One, which is the first thing I ever read of Irigaray, which is extraordinary, which is about lips, it's about labial lips, it's about vaginal lips, it's about female genitalia, and that connects with the Baobab image in Kaufman. This is something that appears a great deal in the feminism of that period, in France anyway, with Helen Sixou's Laugh of Medusa, which is all about castration as well. There's an emphasis on trying to undermine what Jacques Derrida called phallologocentrism, the association of the erect penis with the word, with truth, with authority, etc., etc. That the whole masculine edifice was built up on these metaphors, effectively. So phallologocentrism unites the phallus, the word, logos, and centrality. All these things are centralized in some way. So by playing around with the imagery and the metaphorical power of female genitalia and asserting it over male genitalia, the idea is you begin to undermine a particular way of viewing the world. And what you hopefully end up with what Sixou once called writing with the body, which for her was a very feminine form of writing and a feminine form of philosophy, which comes from a different source. I mean, it obeys some of the rules of rigor associated with traditional patriarchal philosophy, but it takes it to a new place. And what do you find with the marine lover of Friedrich Nietzsche? Luce Irigaray is an example of that. Although she differed from Sixou in some ways. I mean, she's doing something quite similar. She's writing philosophy, but in a way that's very lyrical and very attentive to metaphor, in a way that a poet might be. Poets are crafts people who attend very closely to language, to the rhythm of language, to the tools and instruments of language, metaphor, metonym, synoptique, all these different ways in which you can play around with images. And some of these philosophers are doing the same thing. Yeah, Karen.
Can I ask then what you or Nietzsche or any of us would make of the idea of artistic truth?
That's a really good question. Yeah, because that's very central to Nietzsche. Is that different? Is artistic truth different to, say, scientific truth?
I'm asking the question. I'm not going to answer it for once. I want to hear from you.
Anybody else want to say something?
Well,
I think artistic expression is about exploration just as much as science is.
Exploration or experiment, did you say?
Exploration, I think.
Exploration. Yeah, I mean, there's different parameters. I guess the actual techniques of science and technology are different to the techniques of art, but there are techniques and technologies attached to both. Our artists, I mean, you know, the idea that artists are aspiring to truth, for example, is a romantic idea. It goes back to this notion that truth, Shelley wrote about, you know, how poets have become the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Shelley was writing in the early 19th century at a time when the artist had become commodified and central, in which traditional religion was not exactly dying, but was becoming less central and less important. And the point that Shelley's making as an atheist and as an anarchist is that the kinds of truth that we used to try and draw from religion, from God, from priests, from holy books, now appear spontaneously in the enthusiasms, outpourings of poets, artists, and composers. That there is some integral truth, some access to a greater source of life that the creative individual has. That's the romantic vision of truth. And it, although you could argue that people have moved on from romanticism, it's still very present, I think, in contemporary culture in a lot of ways.
You made a comment about Shakespeare about half an hour ago.
Nothing new under the sun.
He knew everything that fits entirely into that paradigm.
Yeah. Well, he had quite a lot to say about truth as well.
I'm in agreement with you. He did know everything and did say everything, and there is nothing new under the sun. I'm not a romantic with a capital R. But I find myself using this idea of the artistic truth as a commonplace, as something I don't challenge. Yeah, there you go.
Well, people talk about, if you're watching a good drama on television, you might talk about psychological truth. That there's something about that drama that feels true to you. It corresponds to your own experience, you know, in the way people behave. So there is that notion of truth as well.
Art is a lie that reveals the truth.
Art's what?
Art is
a
a
lie.
lie that reveals the truth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, then there's another strand.
Picasso?
Which, art's a lie that reveals the truth. I mean, that's a
Picasso.
strand that comes from Nietzsche in a way too, and Oscar Wilde. The idea of fabrication. Wilde wrote quite a few really interesting essays about that all art was about fabrication. Aestheticism, which is a movement in France and Britain in particular in the 1890s when Nietzsche had his breakdown, certainly drew on Nietzsche in that respect, but it was about making your own life a work of art for a start, your own existence, making yourself a work of art, but making everything aesthetic. Everything needed to be aesthetic primarily, even ethics. You know, morality was aesthetic ultimately.
I mean,
So,
isn't the truth about coming to some sort of understanding that everybody has an intrinsic
value? No.
I was just, isn't the truth about coming to some sort of understanding that everyone has an intrinsic value?
Well, all right, yeah, you're connecting truth and value. I mean, they're two very loaded words. Is value the same as truth, or are they? How are they related? How are they connected?
I think the truth is value, but I think that what I said before about having to strip away the value system that we're used to, I think in order to try and build from the ground up a new value system which includes everyone.
Yeah, I mean that's a utopian gesture, but I mean behind that lies another thing that's a common binary in philosophy: is fact and value. The fact-value distinction Hume talks about. What is a fact and what is a value? Now, traditionally, facts belong to science. For example, you know, you verify or falsify things because they're facts, and we do use the word fact a lot to refer to stuff out there in the world, or to refer to our own feelings and how we feel even. Whereas a value is a measurement that cannot be quantified in quite the same way. I mean, that's the traditional argument. But from Hume onwards, and certainly Nietzsche, the fact-value distinction has often been collapsed. So a fact is just another kind of value, a more embedded value, a more sedimented value. This is the kind of line that Foucault's pursuing at a certain period. Anyway, that all facts are fundamentally values. They're just values that happen to have been around for quite a while and haven't changed too much. And, you know, scientific laws could be the same. This is analytic philosophy as well. Willard Quine, who's definitely an analytic philosophy, more or less argues that all these empirical facts that science have produced are only true up to a point. You know, they might not be true tomorrow. Maybe the universe is contingent. So all the laws of science that we take for granted that allow us to function technologically may change instantly. There's nothing beyond habit in our experience to persuade us that that might not be the case. It's merely that we are creatures of habit and used to thinking that way.
I made a post where I used the word pleb.
Pleb.
And you didn't reply to it directly, but you said you didn't think it was a class thing. I think so. And I really, it was just a very bad choice of language. It was late at night. I've been drinking. Even when I was writing it, I knew it was kind of not the right word, not what I meant. But what I actually did mean was that I remember hearing back in the 70s, I guess, that the future television was there would be loads more channels and they wouldn't all be controlled in this country. There'd be more, and they wouldn't all be controlled by the BBC. And a lot of them would be supported by advertising. And America already had loads of channels that were supported by advertising. And we've seen this come to pass, haven't we? And I suppose what I meant was, because I posted a thing with
Brian McGee.
Yeah. I suppose what I really meant was that if you had the money to do it, you could probably, for all I know, there is a dedicated philosophy channel. Sky Arts probably got something.
Yeah.
No, I haven't got TV myself. But,
well, I mean, look, right, if we live in the current age, as we've seen from American television, it's not inconceivable that someone could come up with an alternative reality channel based on QAnon. It's probably happening already.
They got one, Kardashians, isn't it?
Well, in a sense. So, you know, this idea of the fact value distinction gets dangerous This is the point, and this is the version of Nietzsche which is often taken to lead to Trump and QAnon, because everything moves into a state of absolute epistemological relativism. Nothing is true, everything is permitted, as famously you find in William Burroughs quoting The Old Man of the Mountain, and so on and so forth. It's an old idea, and you know, Burroughs is picking up from an older idea. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted.
I think in terms of value, I think trying something you like, kind of like trying to make something of yourself in order to be valued. Whereas I think if we're taught that we have an intrinsic value in ourselves already, then I think that there wouldn't be so many problems.
Well, right. I mean, there's all those notions about, well, self-esteem and so on. And yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. Self-value is an aspect of this. And I mean, again, this is something from the Nietzsche perspective is taken up arguably by Foucault when he talks about the care of self. That's certainly an aspect of it. But the evaluative process outside ourselves is really what Nietzsche's focused on, the way in which values generate reality. And that could apply to yourself too, obviously. But this word value clearly shifts around a lot. It can be applied in a lot of different places, like the word truth. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That's one part of it, but I think there's a broader notion of value at stake here, arguably. And that version of value figures itself through figuration in language, through metaphor. I mean, another thing that several thinkers in this period talked about a great deal was the difference between the way in which language is described in English as, say, literal or figurative. You know, when we say something is literally happening, what that means, in fact, is figurative, because literary means literature, means a way of using language to create a construction, to construct a fabrication of the real world. So saying that something is literally true is actually means the opposite of what it seems to mean in some way. But usually it's opposed to figuration, which is the use of language to create effects in one form or another. In the same way as a painter might use paint to create an image which might be recognizable to us or not, or might convey some emotions. Figuration is really quite important. Figuration is opposed to mimesis, in that sense, this idea of creating things which directly reflect reality or are transparent to that reality. And the relationship between mimesis and figuration is another thing that is drawn from Nietzsche's ideas by post-structuralism, to look at the world around us. When we think something is mimetic, we're describing something accurately, what's actually going on there? We might be describing these things verbally or using film or countless other ways. But in the end, we're always using some kind of figuration. We're constructing it. Every form of expression, representation has an intrinsic grammar. That grammar can shift, clearly, but there are grammatical rules in place which enable communication to take place at all. The point of this generation, anyway, is all this is taking place in language, what they call the text. The
So
text
have we arrived
is
at
behind reality.
Have we arrived at a truth? Then?
That's a good point. I mean, you know, to make that statement sounds like truth, but you know, some of the people in that period would say, well, it immediately deconstructs itself anyway. You know, as soon as you make a statement like that, which seems to be announcing some sort of truth or reality, you're immediately undermining by virtue of the fact you've made that announcement in that period. I mean, it annoyed people a lot when
why is it undermined? Why is it undermined?
It has, well, if you're in that post-structuralist mindset, any affirmation you make automatically implies its opposite. You know, that's just taken as read. That's kind of as read. That's interesting.
Yeah, but that's
understood. You know,
that's not that. Well, that's if I say that's ridiculous. What's the what did you call them? Post-structuralist. What are they?
Well, I mean, you know, some post-structuralists, deconstructionists probably start deconstructing the word ridiculous, and you know, take it apart and work out what it means to actually express something as ridiculous. Who is ridiculing who, and why?
I mean, it's all very interesting, but it's not getting us. So, that's
no, sure.
So what I've been doing recently, because when I started FUB, there wasn't much philosophy. It was mostly sociology, humanities. Then I gradually started to do more philosophy, mainly because that's what there was. but also because I started to get interested. And so I started after a while. To begin with, I just listened to people and maybe asked the odd question. Then I started to ask, do you think a particular philosophy was actually trying to get to some kind of truth? Or do you think they were maybe doing it, you know, they had career stuff in mind, or they had the next book or something, you know, another motive? You know, are they sincerely exploring into the reality and the truth? So I'm asking you now what you think of Nietzsche. Do you think he's playing games? Do you think he's showing off his?
He's certainly playing, but you know, playing can be serious. He would claim, and Derrida would similarly say that. You know, we play with language, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have serious intent. I think Nietzsche can. I think there's an aspect of Nietzsche that is very therapeutic, potentially. Really, but I mean, the danger here is trying to caricature Nietzschean ideas. You can say, oh, this is what eternal recurrence means. This is what the Übermensch means. But as soon as you say that from a Nietzschean perspective, you need to look very closely at the time and place of that announcement. What?
You can characterize without caricaturing, can't you?
You can characterize without caricaturing, yeah. But to some degree, every characterization once made needs to be situated and contextualized in terms of the relations of power that are operative at that particular moment in the Nietzschean way of looking at things.
From everything you've said tonight, at least, everything's emerged. I mean, it seems that Nietzsche didn't really think that you could access any fundamental truths. If I'm reading.
Well, he was more interested in the will to truth than the object of truth, put it that way.
What does that mean?
That human beings need truth. We need it.
Yeah.
Function. Okay. Yeah. And whether it's real or not is secondary to our need for it, ultimately. You know, I mean, he talks about necessary fictions, and, you know, believe that many aspects of our lives are necessary fictions. We need the fictions to be able to live, because none of us have the strength to live without those fictions.
Is he the first person to have come up with the concept of necessary fictions? Or did the Greeks get there first?
You could argue Shakespeare got his own version of it, I guess.
I suppose that's true.
Well, Shakespeare said everything first, didn't he?
Yeah.
But as far as I know, that phrase, I first came across it in Nietzsche. I can't think of anywhere it occurred before that. Freud took it up. I mean, Freud was curious, you know. He clearly knew as Nietzsche, but didn't like to talk about it. That's another story, but yeah. I mean, the aim of this session really, I mean, first of all, is to look at the way feminism used Nietzsche, but also the focus on language, which a lot of Nietzscheans drew on in that period, in the post-structuralist period. But over next week, we're going to move back to the conceptual ideas like transhumanism, post-humanism, the Übermensch, what Nietzsche actually meant by that, if anything, whether we can actually say what he meant by it or what he didn't mean by it, and what the implications are for where we are. You know, this is your thing, you know, talking to you, Dan, about transhumanism and so on. Post-humanism and transhumanism, not necessarily the same thing, as you know, but they blend at certain points. And there are other things like our relation to the non-human as well. So the concept of the human, but, you know, it's always important to pay attention to language, because that's really important, and style. Style is substance, in a sense, for Nietzsche, and substance is style. It's important to bear that in mind. Surface is depth, and depth is surface. He's not consistent. Nietzsche never is, but he's consistent in his inconsistency about these things. So yeah, we'll do that. And also, you know, you mentioned, actually, Dan, you mentioned Buddhism and Taoism, and I thought we might as well have a look at that in the last week, because there's quite a lot been written on Nietzsche and Eastern thinking. So that's where we're heading.
I think he got that from Schopenhauer, didn't he?
Yeah. In German philosophy, there was a long interest in non-Western thinking. Leibniz certainly was very deeply involved in the information that was coming up from China. And the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which is like the Chinese equivalent to the tarot cards in the West, Leibniz used to develop his idea of differential calculus and the basis of computer technology in a way. So there is this curious kind of relationship between Western and Eastern thinking. It's because, well, it's because people are traveling, and a lot of the people who are traveling from Europe are obviously out, you know, to exploit or to trade or to occupy or conquer, whatever, for things that people in empires do. But there are also a lot of scholars going along with them as well, picking up ideas, and scholars are different. Scholars like scholarship, they like information, knowledge. So that was coming back, that was traveling between East and West. So what you have in Japan, this is in the 20th century, a figure like Nishida and Nishitani, who are deeply involved in Nietzschean thinking, combine Nietzsche with Zen Buddhism in the Kyoto school, immediately after the Second World War. You know, I'm really quite interested in that. They have a different conception of nothingness and the void to most Western philosophy. So yeah, I want to look at that in a couple of weeks. But first of all, we're looking at the beyond human bit. So anyway, yeah. Any further thoughts on language or truth or feminism and Nietzsche?
So he didn't, I mean, you get him, as you said at the beginning, he didn't really have any satisfactory sexual relationships with women, did he?
Not as far as we know, no. Certainly doesn't look that way.
Some people say he died of syphilis.
Yeah.
There's
very little evidence of that. Yeah, maybe.
There's very little evidence. You say there's very little.
Well, there's no real evidence of it. Put it that way. It could be the case, but we don't know. Karen?
Can I weigh in with a bit of biography?
Go on.
The idea that Nietzsche went mad, the consensus opinion based on biography is that he was displaying symptoms in childhood, that he probably had what his dad had, which was increasing brain damage, very, very slow, but increasing brain damage over time, probably caused by the blood vessels being constricted and him just not getting enough oxygen to bits of his brain, which would then gradually die off. In addition, he may well have had syphilis. But the type of syphilis that drives you mad, tertiary syphilis, there's zero evidence that that he had that at all. But in those days, everybody had syphilis, and the mental hospitals, the vast majority of people who were in there for madness had tertiary syphilis. Therefore, if you've got syphilis and you appear to be mad, they assume a causal relationship. But I mention all of this partly in defense of this sort of idea that I posted, that we kind of view sexual, moral stuff gets conflated, but also because I think that the romantic idea of the madman could be looked at and undermined. Yeah. I think that's quite important. This idea that Nietzsche was extraordinary. Was he extraordinary because he was differently wired, or was he extraordinary despite it?
This is great. We can pick up on all this next week.
Did he go mad or did he get ill?
That's a really good question.
Yeah. Was he sexually polluted? Was he sexually aberrant because he was sexually abstinent?
Was he a great masturbator, as Wagner thought he was?
Or did Wagner sort of realise that his eyesight was bad and conflate this idea that wanking makes you go blind? Do you know what I mean? We have all of these kind of ideas that we impose upon biography.
Well, the reason I brought it up is because surely it must have had some effect on the way you saw women. If he'd never had a...
Well, I mean, it supposedly had the only sexual experience he had was in a brothel and when he was in the Prussian army, supposedly. And that didn't go very well, But there was a fascination with madness, and the mad artist Hölderlin, the great German poet, who very much, made a theatrical performance out of madness, in a sense, but he did go mad. Was one of Nietzsche's great heroes,
Dan, what about the idea that if somebody has a stable sexual relationship, that's going to tell you something about how they viewed women? Or what if somebody has serial sexual relationships with women, that's going to tell you something about their relationship to women? Then there's a guy who doesn't have sex, that's going to tell you something about, well, there's such generalization in all of that. There are a lot of sort of superstructural ideas about...
I think we might be speaking at cross purposes. I'm not sure what you meant. So what I'm saying is, I think if someone is in a fulfilling sexual relationship, they're likely, if presuming it's a heterosexual one, then I think it's going to have the way they see their partner, the way they see other women. If it's a man, then I think it's going to colour their view. If they, I mean.
See, this is interesting to me because feminists had a look at all of these ideas. What you're describing is a very contemporary version of a relationship, what's known as a companionate marriage.
Yeah.
And that's a new invention. Most of history, most of the world didn't do relationships that way. And a relationship could be, by any definition, fulfilling without impacting on a deeply misogynistic relationship. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
we have a contemporary set of assumptions that we bring to history.
Yeah, I'm not doing that. I don't think that's what I really don't think that's what I'm doing. I think what I'm doing is to say that it seems very clear to me that if your only experience of the opposite sex is very bad, it's negative, it's going to, I mean, you don't think that's going to colour your view?
I honestly, I don't think I could generalize one way or the other about whether I felt it would colour somebody's view. I don't feel like I've got enough data.
There's this whole tradition of what is called psychobiography, which is very much about this, and it can get very facile in the end. I mean, it may be of some interest, but I don't know. I mean, there are plenty of male philosophers who treated women appallingly who had sex, you know.
Plenty of artists did the same.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I don't know if that really applies. He did sometimes seem to display, you know, what was called by later thinkers an almost feminine sensibility towards women. You know, he had another side to him, Nietzsche. It's curious. It's very hard to know what his celibacy was about, but it wasn't inconceivable back then. A lot of people were celibate, men and women. It was a different kind of world, you know. Celibacy was, we kind of assume everybody has to have sex now, but that hasn't always been the case. Arguably.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think it's becoming quite fashionable to live alone, isn't it now? Yeah. More people live alone, I think, now. Well, maybe not more, but a lot.
More than before, yeah. But anyway, we're kind of wandering off subject a bit here, I think.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's very good. So yeah, next week, I think, yeah, it's a good idea, Karen. We'll fold madness into this as well. The idea of the madman and the Übermensch. Okay. So I'm knackered, so I'm going to go and have a rest.
Before you go, I sometimes find difficulty because you post quite a lot of material, which is good, but I'm not always able to find the, you know, amongst the chaff.
What are you looking for?
Right, okay.
Well, email me and tell me what you want.
I'll have a think about that and get back to you.
Send it to you.
I suppose I'm thinking of primary importance, or it's all important in your view.
Yeah, I would say it is. Noel, did you want to say something? I saw you raise your hand a second ago.
No, I was saying thanks. That was great. That was really good.
Okay, good. Great. Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, I'll see you next week, if not before. Next week, Superman.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good stuff.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.